I raised 3 children, and I don't know about you, but I was always accused of playing favorites. Usually it was because the 2 that gave me a hard time were jealous of the way that I interacted with my middle child. What is it about middle children, right? Kind of peacemakers and all that. But I wasn't really trying to play favorites, but there was better interaction between me and the middle child for sure. I don't know, any of you with multiple children, did you play favorites? I mean, Sarah, did you play favorites? No way. I'm sure you did. Whether you realize it or not. I mean, things happen, right? My other 2 just gave me fits, so, you know. But anyway, you move on. So the question is, does God play favorites? Is God partial to some people over others? That's kind of a fancy theological question that people talk about. And if you go to the Bible seems to answer, yeah, God seems to have favorites. In the Old Testament, we had one reading today from Isaiah. You know, Isaiah gives the impression that God plays favorites favors the nation of Israel. He says, "Here is my servant," and servant in biblical times, or for Isaiah, servant meant the suffering servant or the nation of Israel. It's likely, and so Isaiah says that God has chosen the servant in whom my soul delights. So at least in Isaiah's mind, God seems to play favorites with the nation of Israel. The same would be true if we had read our psalm reading for today, which is Psalm 29, which is a royal psalm. So it was probably read at the coronation of a king of Israel. And God is seen in these royal psalms as also a king-like figure. And in Psalm 29, it ends with saying, "May the Lord give strength to His people," like God has His people. That's playing favorites when you consider how many peoples there were in the world at that time. He says, "May the Lord bless His people with peace." So yeah, according to the psalmist, God plays favorites. Now when we get to the New Testament, of course, that circle of God's favoritism expands a little bit. In the reading we heard from the book of Acts, the Apostle Peter, who is a Jewish man, he's giving a sermon after Jesus' resurrection. He's got an audience, and he seems to imply that the circle has expanded. He said, "I truly understand that God shows no partiality." Now that's a big statement coming from someone who had been taught his whole life that God favors His people. He said, God shows no partiality. Every nation who fears Him and does what is right is acceptable to Him. So Peter seems to have had one of those, I get it, moments of clarity by drawing the circle of God's favoritism a little bit wider than His people had previously imagined. But he still put limits on this. Even though he says God shows no partiality, he qualifies that by saying that it extends to people who fear God and do what is right. Well, presumably that leaves a lot of people still out of the circle, the list of God's favorites. And then in our reading from Matthew, we see God's favoritism pointed toward a specific individual, which is, of course, Jesus. He is baptized. We know the story. We heard it a moment ago. And, the Holy Spirit descends like a dove, and there's a voice from heaven that says, "This is my Son. This is my Son." There's some favoritism there with, he says, "my beloved." So I love this Son, and I am well pleased with this Son. So even if we want to be a little weird and suggest that God had several children like Jesus, Jesus seems to have been his favorite child. So that's the setting for what I want to talk about for a few minutes. How many of you have heard the phrase identity politics? And by the way, I'm not going to get political, but identity politics is the phrase that we use. Basically it means that when you engage in identity politics, you're prioritizing the concerns of a group, usually your own group, but maybe a group that you have sympathy for or compassion for. You're prioritizing that group over other groups. Not that you're saying yours is better, but at least at that moment you are engaging in identity politics when you give priority to their concerns. And whether we are aware of it or not, we all do this. We all belong to groups, or another word that's kind of thrown around a lot, a tribe. We all belong to multiple tribes, which I'll talk about in a second. And it's human nature that we will be partial, that we'll play favorites with our tribe. That's just who we are. And so we will focus on the interests of one group over others. God may not show partiality, but we sure do. That's who we are. We can't help it. In fact, here's kind of interesting. We don't belong to just one tribe, do we? We belong to multiple tribes or groups of people based on various identifying marks, identifying characteristics or categories, such as age. I recently entered into a new age category, is what I hear, because I can get discounts at places I normally couldn't. I had to let go of my membership in the UCC 40s and 50s category. I had to write them and say, I can no longer interact with you people, because you're not my tribe anymore. You're the young peoples, right? So age is a category, so is religion, obviously. Socioeconomic class, your profession, your occupation, your culture, your language, your ethnicity, your race, your gender identity, your preference, your sexual orientation, whether you live in the country, whether you live in the city, whether you're a veteran or not. I'm missing a lot, but you get the idea of what I'm talking about. There are many, many categories out there, and we each identify with some of those categories, but not all of them. And so recently our church, our council passed a non-discriminatory policy because we don't want to play favorites if we can help it. We're basically saying we don't want to do that, but we do and we will. But we're saying we're going to try not to blatantly play favorites if we can help it. And so the goal of identity politics is simply to help to lift up people who are relatively or have been relatively powerless, and help them to gain more power, self-determination, more freedom, things like that. And of course, some classic examples in history would be the civil rights movement, and I'll get to MLK here in a minute, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement, things like that. These are examples of identity politics where you're trying to lift up and give more power to a previously powerless, relatively powerless or marginalized category. Now, of course, when this happens, you get a little pushback. There's always a little pushback usually from people who may fear that they're going to lose some of their power, some of the perks that came with who they are. The word that's bandied around a lot is the word privilege. Some people are afraid they're going to lose a little bit of their privileged identity. And of course, the classic example of this tribe that likes to push back a little bit is the tribe to which I belong, which is the stereotypical straight white male. The stereotypical straight white male. And this, as you know, obviously is a group that has enjoyed immense historical clout, if you want to use that word, a lot of perks and advantages and so forth. And so just as the Apostle Peter and then later Paul experienced people being uncomfortable with what they were doing when they were trying to expand the circle of God's favoritism, so today, when we do that, when we look at a group of people and say, oh, we need to include you in the circle a little more, there's going to be a little pushback and people will be a little bit uncomfortable. And I have to admit, I would be lying if I said that it didn't make me uncomfortable at times as a straight white male. because I can see the handwriting on the wall. My Waterloo is near. The apocalypse is upon me. I get that. My tribe, at least that particular tribe that I belong to, has had to make a little room, so to speak. And although I support that intellectually, I'm still human. I still have emotions, and I still have feelings. And so there's part of me, like you, that wants to be part of God's favorite children. We want to belong to God's favorite tribe and that sort of thing. That's just normal. The pulpit that I usually inhabit, when you think about it, historically is a symbol of the clout, the perks, the privileges that I'm talking about of my tribe throughout history. Have you noticed the pictures on the wall in the narthex of the 12 pastors here in the last 130 years? They're all men, aren't they? They're all men. And that would be true in many congregations of our type. It's just the way it has been. Women only recently, when you think about it in terms of history, relatively recently have been able to occupy these pulpits. And yet now, because of the growing power of what I would call identity politics in the church, especially the United Church of Christ, women, and I know this because I kind of keep tabs on this through social media and the UCC website, women are occupying in our denomination some of the most prestigious pulpits in the country today. That's just a fact. It's happening. So the worm has turned a little bit, right? Some of you know, I'll just continue with my personal story, how this relates to me. A few years ago when I came here, I had tried to become a regular devotional writer for the Still Speaking devotional writers group for the National UCC. I had previously had some 9 or 11 or so devotionals that they had published. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to be one of their regular writers. So I wrote to them and said, is there any way I can become not a guest writer, but can I become a regular writer? And I was told that I was, or I am, the wrong demographic. The wrong demographic, because I'm a straight white male from the Midwest. And apparently there wasn't a lot of room for that. We've talked for a long time about how women have this glass ceiling. Well, I hit a glass ceiling for what I was trying to do. I hit that wall, that identity politics wall, and I wasn't going past that. Because of that, I have to admit, I was almost shocked. A couple of weeks ago, I received an email that said I'd been nominated to be a delegate for General Synod, for the next General Synod in 2021, which will be held in Kansas City, Missouri. I'll be representing the Missouri Mid-South. I haven't been chosen yet, but I've been nominated, so there's a good chance I'll get it. And I have to admit, I was surprised that they had room on their slate of delegates for someone, and I like to use this phrase in reference to me, as someone who is male, pale, stale, and straight. Male, pale, stale, and straight. It has a nice ring to it, right? But I was surprised. I thought that those opportunities had come and gone, that I thought my dinosaur status was not retroactive, that I would always be a dinosaur. So anyway, we'll see what happens with that. So this is my brief introduction of a very simplistic introduction to what we call identity politics. And it brings me back to my original question. Does God play favorites? Does God give preference to certain groups of people? Now, if you were to ask the Pope Francis, that question, he'd give you an interesting answer. Pope Francis from South America, and he is what they call a liberation theologian. And liberation theologians from South America, the cornerstone of their theological system is that God gives preference to the poor. God gives preference to the poor. Now think about, if you were to apply that teaching to us in our context as relatively prosperous Americans, it would make us a little bit uncomfortable, right? But again, that's what they call liberation theology. Now, whether God plays favorites or not, it's God's prerogative. I just think, obviously for you and I, we just need to treat everyone with as much respect as we possibly can, because if you've ever been to a funeral here, we always use John 14, where Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many rooms," or many mansions. So God has a very large roof. And if we understand that, then I think we're on the way in terms of identity politics, understanding we need to treat everybody as, with respect as God's children. So, again, it's a very real thing. Whether you think that you're engaged in identity politics or not, has nothing. I'm not talking about voting. I'm just talking about how you live your life and so forth. It's a reality, and so we have to, as Christians, we have to figure out how do we operate in that complex tapestry of humanity, knowing with all the diversity and all that. What do we do? So recently I've been reading a book by one of my favorite authors. I won't bore you with all the details, but his name is Jonathan Haidt, A-I-D-T, not hate, H-A-T-E. But he's a social psychologist. And he and his co-author, they talk a lot about this phenomenon of identity politics. And here's their take on it, and I think it's a good take. And this is your takeaway, okay? Given the reality of what I've just described. They say if you look at humanity, we evolved in the context of living in separate tribes, groups, because for a long time, we were not close to one another. We lived apart from one another in small tribes. And when we did encounter one another, we often engaged in violent conflict. And so, tribes tried to protect themselves, and so they would often defend themselves. So, and that's who we were. That's who humanity was for a long time. And so the world was easily divided into us versus them. You had to for the sake of survival. Us versus them. And so today, them might be somebody from a foreign country. It might be somebody who votes for the other party. It might be somebody who belongs to another religion, another faith group, or just the church down the street. That's who we are, and that's how we will always be. Identity issues or politics is inevitable. So how do we operate in that context? There are two ways to operate. One is not good, the other one is good. So here's the way that's not good. This is the way we should avoid. And the writer of this book calls it common enemy identity politics. Common enemy. This means that you look at people who are not part of your group or your tribe as the enemy. So rather than appeal to your common humanity, you think there has to be a winner and a loser. The only way for you to win is for other people to lose. And so any ideology that lifts up one group while tearing down another group, that is called common enemy identity politics. We ought to do our best to avoid that as much as we can. The other option, the good option, is called common humanity identity politics. Common humanity identity politics. To look at people, even though we're all different and diverse, and we all belong to different tribes, we all share common humanity. So Martin Luther King Jr., his holidays is coming up fairly soon. He's a good example of this, because his movement, while their movement was appealing to our common humanity, at the same time they were trying to apply political pressure in order to help gain more self-determination and freedom for African Americans. You hear what I'm saying? At the same time they were appealing to our common humanity, they used that leverage to gain more political freedom for African Americans. So King did not believe there had to be winners and losers. He said we could all be winners. No one needs to give up their own self-determination and their own freedom so that other people can have those things. We just need to draw the circle bigger. That's all we need to do. So I apologize for this sounding more like a lecture. When I learn something interesting, I like to share it. But I'm convinced that we need to be aware and informed about what people are calling identity politics, especially since we all engage in it, whether we know it or not, we're doing it. And all of us belong to multiple tribes that are struggling either to gain or maintain power, self-determination, and political freedom. So even as we play favorites, and we will, we need to remind ourselves that we do belong to one human family, that we are all God's children, and that we have equal value and worth in God's eyes. This is the only ideology that any of us ever need to subscribe to. And if we can do this, then maybe someday we will hear a voice from heaven declare, "These are my children, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Amen.